So we appreciate your attendance, and I just want to take a minute to walk through a couple of the WebEx functions and cover our Q&A process. All participants are muted to reduce background noise, echoes, or feedback. We ask that you remain muted for the whole webinar. To be respectful of everyone's time and to keep this webinar to the hour allotted, we have planned a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We ask that you send any questions throughout the webinar as a chat or in the Q&A panel at the bottom, and we will do our best to answer those live. If you've only dialed in through audio in order to ask the questions and use the chat, you will need to join the webinar through the WebEx link that's been sent to you by email. To send a question with chat, simply hover over your screen and you'll see a round button with the speech bubble. Click on that button and your chat panel will open. Type your question in the message box and press enter. And we will do our best to answer any questions, but we will be sure to reach out after via email should we not be able to address your question. Okay, so that should cover any WebEx or Q&A concerns. I'm going to turn it over to Mike now.
Yes, Alex, if you can provide the presenter capacity to me, I'm not getting the required button. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this webinar, Increase the Level of Certainty for Deliberate Fire Investigations. I'm Mike Weiskell, one of the technical directors and senior investigators at IFIC Forensics, a Jensen Hughes company. As a side point, we will be changing over fully to Jensen Hughes soon, so please bear this in mind. At the end of this 1 hour webinar, there will be an opportunity to message in your questions. Now, in my career, I have always found investigating deliberate fires interesting and rewarding, particularly when I find credible evidence to support my opinion. But there is a problem. Arson remains a significant cause for fire in our communities. In 2017-18, the UK Fire and Rescue Services reported that out of 213,000 fires that they attended, 108,000 of those were deliberate, that being 50.5%. And as you can see for the different countries in the UK, England 48, Scotland 57, Wales 58, and Northern Ireland 66% of the fires attended were reported as deliberate. Now, the internet reveals a lot of figures and statistics relating to economic costs due to the deliberate fires. Estimated economic costs for arson in the UK in 2017-2018 was 1.49 billion. Now, the Home Office crime surveys estimate that fire services were only notified between 13 and 26% of all fires, with a potential economic cost in 2017-18 more likely being between 5.73 and 11.46 billion. Now, according to the Association of British Insurers, during 2017-18, 29% of the commercial fire claims in the UK can be considered deliberate, whilst 4 to 5% of domestic fire claims were considered deliberate in the UK. There appears to be a common trend between arson fraud and times of financial hardship. The cost of fire damage to the insurance industry rose by 16% during the 2008 financial crisis. The UK-wide COVID-19 pandemic lockdown has also seen an impact on insurance claims. A 40% increase in fire claims during the lockdown has been reported, with 36% of outbuilding fires considered to be arson related. Research studies have shown that suspicious vehicle fire events are significantly related to unemployment and interest rates. Now, these are generally accepted definitions, but it is recognized and appreciated that these definitions may vary in different jurisdictions. So fire raising, the willful and reckless setting fire to the property of another. Willful meaning intentionally or deliberately. Reckless meaning something more than careless or negligent. Arson, the willful or malicious burning of property, such as a building, especially with criminal or fraudulent intent. And deliberate, intentionally ignited under circumstances in which the person knows that the fire should not be ignited. Motives. Each one of these motives are topics for discussion in and of themselves, and they may include profit or fraud, concealment of a crime, mental illness, vandalism, thrill-seeking, and the others on the side to the right. Now, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, and often they occur two or more in the actual arson incident. I have had a number of times where that has been a fraudulent claim, but they've tried to conceal a crime. For example, they had one fire and then they called out the fire service to that one. They didn't get the result they wanted, so they set a second fire, but called the police out to the second one and told them that it was only one fire. But through my interpretation of fire damage patterns, I was able to say that this was two separate fires. You can also get examples of mental illness along the lines of thrill seeking, or even vandalism along the lines with thrill seeking. You can get the racially or religious hatred with intimidation, or even with intimidation and some personal animosities. So you can see the connections. But arson is usually a targeted crime with a specific motivation. Now, for a fire investigator, regardless of if they are from the police, the fire service, or the private sector, they have to bear in mind the weight of evidence, and in doing so, consider the elements of proof. Where could this investigation go in the future? So those elements of proof we need to think about when we're doing an investigation are: there has been a burning of property, the burning is incendiary in origin, the burning is shown to be started with malice, that is, with the intent of destroying property. And we also have to bear in mind, right, is there the motive, the reason for the fire, the means, the ability to commit the crime, and was there opportunity? Did who we think or possibly have time, to commit the crime? So things to bear in mind for the investigator. Now today we share the perspective from both the public and private sector fire investigator. I have had the pleasure of working in both sectors. With us today we have Watch Commander Nick Docherty from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. He is part of a national resource providing a 24-hour response and support for operational personnel and partner agencies. Nick has served 29 years in the fire service, fulfilling various roles from firefighter to incident commander to fire investigator. Our surprise guest speaker from the Scottish Police Authority is Graham Strong, a forensic scene examiner, supervisor. Graham has 20 years scene examination experience and in his role has given expert opinion in court on numerous occasions. We also have my good friend and colleague, Gareth Williams. Gareth has a wealth of experience in arson investigations, post-blast investigations, and improvised explosive device design investigations. He has strong experience with fires and explosions, as well as numerous other crime scenes. Investigating fires is challenging, regardless of if deliberate or accidental. Both the public sector and private sector have their unique challenges with fire scenes and gathering evidence to opine deliberate as a cause of fire. We hope this webinar shares some of the challenges in terms of arson investigation and gathering evidence to opine for a deliberate fire cause. So without further delay, I am going to let Nick start by sharing the fire service perspective.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that introduction. Hi, my name is Nick Docherty, and I currently work as a fire investigation officer for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. And just because I'm aware that some people might be unfamiliar with the Scottish Service, just a bit of background. The service was formed in 2013 when the 8 previous individual services were merged, and prior to that merging, only 2 services had a dedicated fire investigation department, and that was Strathclyde and Lothian and Borders. The other 6 did carry out fire investigation. They'd be done by the initial incident commanders, and a supervisory officer would come along with a reference for fire investigation and produce pretty rudimentary reports. After that amalgamation, we became the largest fire service in the UK and the 5th largest in the world. So, a bit about Scotland. Currently, we cover 1/3 of the UK landmass. We serve 5.5 million people, and we cover that by 365 fire stations. Geographically, we have the issues that we have 790 islands, of which approximately 150 are inhabited. So we don't have a metropolitan centred response. It's very difficult for us to get to areas quickly, and we have to deal with transport issues, weather conditions, etc. But the 3 locations we do have are based in Aberdeen in the north, Glasgow in the west, and Edinburgh in the east. These 3 units, Livingston in the east where I work, and these 3 units will cover approximately 300 to 400 call-outs per year. And to put that in perspective, the fire service in Scotland will respond to 27,000 fire incidents a year, 10 of which we deem to be primary fire. So we don't attend that much, and most fire investigation will be done by the initial incident commanders. The 3 units, however, are staffed by 26 personnel. We're all experienced, and between us we've attended thousands of fires. So why do we do it? We'll have a statutory requirement, the Fire Scotland Act. It gives us specific powers for obtaining information for entry, and I suppose this is a leverage we have over you guys in the private sector. This allows us access to lots of information. We get access to records, electronic, written records, any access to CCTV, access to the third party. We can also access social work local authority to look at care packages or care providers. We can access care logs. We can look at risk assessments that we put in places, details mental health. And another thing that we have access to is the call logs, the calls that come into our control rooms, which can be quite harrowing sometimes to listen, but provide very good information. So the purpose of fire investigation for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and fire investigation officers, as well as initial incident commanders, is to establish quite simply the origin, cause and fire development. We are completely objective, and I'm not implying that the private sector isn't, but I have never been pressured to come up with a determination ever in any time I've been investigating fires. So the simplest way of looking at that is there's a fire in the kitchen, it's a tumble dryer, deemed to be a failure of a component, and the fire development is spread to a hallway and affected 2 other rooms. Pretty easy, simple, but it's not always like that. So the difficulties that we actually face is, where did the fires happen? How did they happen? What occurred to make it happen? When did it happen? And then we have to prove that whole sequence of events and present our evidence if necessary in court. But what again we have over the private sector is we have that initial information grab that's provided by our crews, who are generally first on the scene. And about the first 15 minutes of a fire crew attending a fire scene, it will be very chaotic and sometimes overwhelming for people, you know, but it allows us that it's raw, uninhibited, unfiltered information. We get that data grab that nobody else gets, and our crews report that back to us. An example of that is an incident commander years ago attended a fire in a remote farm. The occupier on arrival told me exactly what had happened. That was confirmed later on by the fire investigation we'd done. I was later interviewed by one of your colleagues in the private sector, and the occupier story had completely changed. However, that initial information grab allowed for the information to be shared, and the truth actually came out because of that. So our crews, they're always the first on the scene. They see the location of the fire, they see the development, and they look at the timescales. They will notice the forced entry, they will look at the multiple seats of fire, the unexplained fire development. They see the red flags and they report that back to us. And 99% of times, any police or fire investigation that happen is initiated by the crew's first attendants. Now, we capture that data because we send statements to the crews, and they will fill these statements in and they provide us with lots of information. So prior to attending the scene, or post attending the scene, we can have quite a lot of information. So the levels of investigations that we have, we're now calling them tiers, but there's too many tiers in the UK just now. So it's level 1, 2, 3. Level 1, pretty basic. You go out as an incident commander, but the level 1 investigations, they're always recorded in the incident recording system. This is a national electronic recording system. And every time that somebody records a fire incident on that, they have to put the origin and cause. It must be recorded, and a a determination must also be made as whether it was deliberate or accidental in every case. So if we move on to level 2, more complex, not necessarily criminal, but more complex, where we as fire investigation officers will assist partner agencies or crews on the ground or potentially the police. One that springs to mind just now is the Glasgow School of Art. A fire happened there a couple of years ago now. It's the second fire. We've had a fire investigation officer at the scene every single day since that fire, as they're still excavating the scene. And then move on to level 3. And the level 3 is the most serious ones. These are the ones that are probably going to be criminal. They can maybe involve fatal fires or serious fires. And the police are generally always in charge of these incidents. We will work under them and assist them in their investigations. We'll work with the scene examiners and any other resources that the police require. When we attend any incident, we're always looking for, potentially teach all the crews now that any fire seen as a potential crime scene to treat it as such. And I think what I'm going to emphasise today is there's been a massive development in the knowledge and understanding of fire investigation within the fire service. As fire investigation officers, we now give input to our trainees when they're going through their course or training course. We follow that by giving input to the watches at stations. Everybody has to do mandated e-learning, and we'll do case studies. And all the forensic evidence that seems, my colleague will cover that later in his presentation, but our crews are now aware of that. Right? Fire is very disruptive, as is firefighting operations. So we encourage, if possible, prompt extinguishment of a fire. And we want the crews to protect any items or areas of interest. A lot of destruction happens in sort of the close down phase, the dampening down phase. So our crews are very good now at protecting stuff that they think may be of interest. We don't want them to remove things. They leave things in situ, and if they have to remove it, we'll record the position. But more importantly, I think for us is they will limit access to the scene. Right? Now, we are not forensically trained within the fire service, but we're forensically aware. And again, a bit of popular culture, I think it's forensic awareness is just, it's one of these things. Now, there's so many television programs about it that people just have an awareness that they didn't have years ago, and that very much assists us. So how do we investigate a fire? Well, pre-attending at scene, we have databases that we can look at. At the scene, we have a strategy meeting normally with the police, when we devise forensic approaches, common paths, and then we start working with our partners to achieve an end result. An actual scene investigation, well, every fire investigation officer uses a scientific method. So we'll do a preliminary, and we'll do a full investigation. We'll record as we go, we'll discuss things, we'll sample things, and we'll move methodically from the least damaged area to the most damaged area. Post-scene investigation, that's when we grab all that data that I was talking about. We also access to other databases that you guys don't have in the private sector. And then ultimately we'll record and report our findings. This can be quite a formal written report, and we may have to stand in court and give evidence. So the partnership approach, if you can see on the left there, we have the police and the Scottish Police Authority. We have existing protocols that we can share any information when we get it at any time with the police and the Scottish Police Authority. It's not so on the right-hand side with others, the health and safety executive utility companies. We will share limited information with these guys, but it doesn't flow as quickly as it does with the police and the police authority. And unfortunately for you guys, we don't share that much raw information with you. We do share information, but it has to go through the appropriate channels. And I know that can be quite frustrating for you. It can be quite frustrating for us. I know in Scotland, we are very limited. I don't know if that's UK-wide or nationally, but I know it's something that we maybe need to look at and maybe move that forward. But unfortunately, just now, we're governed by what we can share and cannot share with you. This photograph here, it basically just shows fire investigation in miniature. Because what we have here is a fire that occurred on a early hours of a Sunday morning, late on a Saturday night. The incident commander turned up, deemed it to be a deliberate fire, got the police, and the police shut it down for the next day, and we turned up to investigate it. You can see the scaffolding against the building, the two top windows, 2 people self-evacuated out of that building. And this sort of encapsulates the problems that you can have and the challenges. First of all, you've got multiple entry points, just beyond the police. I know it's a small photograph, but there is a number 13. That's the door entry to the stair. That wasn't secured. And you can see 2 people standing outside. Well, that's a pub. And the pub's always very busy on a Saturday night. People go outside to smoke. You're not allowed to smoke in a building, haven't been since 2006 in Scotland. It was also raining that night. So people take cover under the scaffolding, but the door wasn't secured, so people then go inside. So all this information we're getting when we arrive. So if we go inside, it's quite a tight, narrow staircase, a few cigarette ends down there, but people would move up the stairs to smoke. As we get up the stairs, we find the cupboard that the incident commander found, and he deemed that the fire had started in there, and he deemed it to be deliberate. So we take some photographs, and we start excavating a bit further. You can see it's a lot of stuff in there, but we haven't found any ignition points. There's no ignition sources or no electrical stuff in there. But we're going to go through the protocols and investigate, starting outside and move our way in. As we start doing it, and on these photographs, I apologise, they're not very clear, but there is a door that's got an intact lock, so the door wasn't forced. So we start investigating, we find this area, the texture's different from everyone outside. It's on the threshold, and a few inquiries were made with residents, and there was dispute. It was under renovation, residents were getting rehoused, a couple were being evicted. But this was a plastic bucket that was storing lots of junk mail that would come in. There was some rolled up poster tubes, and people would go to the stair and they'd be smoking the stair, and this bucket was used as an ashtray. So we've determined an origin and cause, but was it deliberate? And that's the problem. Was it accidental, deliberate, or was it criminal? And these are the challenges that we then pass on to the police. However, in that case, the area was covered by CCTV. The police accessed that CCTV, and I think they looked at a criminal prosecution because they identified somebody running away from that scene minutes before the alarm was raised. This one here, this picture here shows how the fire service moved on. Crews attended the scene. They had 2 seats of fire, one under the broken window on the right and one in the corner on the right. But they identified that things were they weren't what they expected it to be, so they took care, they never moved anything. They had an ashtray on the chair in the foreground, a candle on the coffee table, and the reason that they deemed that it wasn't potentially accidental was when they moved a bit of glass under the window, there was a protection mark, so they established that the fire had happened after the window was broken. This one here, my colleague will talk more about this from the police about this one, but this shows how the fire service has moved on, because these, excuse me, these 2 items that are arrowed, 20 years ago, this would have just been swept away, washed away with a hose. The crews identified this was out of place, it was significant to the fire that happened. They took steps to secure that evidence, and as investigation happened, that evidence provided some pretty stark information. This next one here, we have a container that clearly had ignitable liquid in it. You can see the trails. Again, 25 years ago, somebody would have picked it up, walked outside and said, look what I've found, but that scene was left completely intact, which meant there's investigation that happened after. It was a pretty pristine scene. You could go in there and our colleagues in the police could sample and get stuff that they require for any prosecutions. The information sharing, I've put this one in because I know this is a bone of contention, but these are the reasons why we don't share information with you guys at the scene or on phone calls as much as we would like to, because data protection, criminal prosecutions, you know, the financial loss again, the cost implications of that data, because there's a charge that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service will levy. There's also the Freedom of Information request and precognitions, which only happens in Scotland. If you want any information about anything, that SFRS Information Governance UK is the one that you should put anything, any request for any information, any fire. That's your point of contact, and you'll be advised by the legal team if they can help. That's me. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention. I'm now going to pass you on to my colleague in the police, Graham, who'll talk more about the scenes. Graham, that's you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Michael, for giving me the opportunity to speak with everyone today. My name's Graham Strong. I am a senior examiner and fire investigator with the Scottish Police Authority, and today I've been asked to go over some of the challenges for evidence collection at deliberate fires, but in looking at those in particular, how some of those evidence types that we're going to have a look at increase our certainty that a fire has been deliberately set or hasn't been deliberately set. As Nick has already stated, the primary goals for a joint fire investigation are going to be to establish the point or point of origin, to look for heat sources at those points, and from there to give an opinion on the cause of the fire. The investigators that attend there are going to use physical indicators, such as those that you can see listed above, to try and help find these points of origin, and from there to move the investigation onwards. But what we're doing is we're doing this in one of the most challenging of crime scenes. A fire scene is unique as far as crime scenes go, in that it's the only crime scene that actively destroys its own evidence as the process of the fire goes on. In the case of most other crime scenes, the opposite would be true. And of course, these challenges are in addition to all of the other challenges you can see there. But the last one I'd point out, the actions carried out by firefighters and by other agencies at the scene, that is the challenge that has the greatest potential to affect, to damage, or to cause the loss of forensic evidence. Now, what we can see is that there can be a number of ways, and again, my colleague Nick has gone over some of them, a number of ways in which forensic evidence at fire scenes can be disturbed. The actions of firefighters, police, paramedics, and any other agency can lead to significant loss or damage to that forensic evidence. I think at this point it's worth just reiterating that Scottish Fire and Rescue, the fire investigation teams in particular, along with the Scottish Police Authority and the police themselves, have worked hard to educate all of the initial attenders, not necessarily just the fire and rescue teams, about the potential for the presence of forensic evidence and the potential, unfortunately, for that evidence to be lost. So when a scene examiner or a chemist attends the scene of the fire, we're often being asked to wear two hats, if you will. First of those is the fire investigator, and Nick has already gone over the role of that. But the second of those is the role of the scene examiner, where we would typically be looking for evidence of a crime having been committed, potentially in addition to the fire having been set, or the fire itself being the crime, and then going on to assess the scene or items within the scene for the potential to identify a culprit from that. Now, obviously, if we see evidence of a crime having taken place, then we start to increase our level of certainty that the fire has been deliberately set. I think Mike spoke eloquently at the start about the direct relationship there is between crime and fires being deliberately set. And when we get to this point in a fire investigation where we're actually looking at the potential for forensic evidence, this is where Locard's principle starts to become relevant to me. As you can see in the slide there, there's a long list of what you might consider traditional forensic evidence types that we might consider to confirm one or more aspects of a scene and then to identify who may be responsible for the setting of that fire or the crime within. But just to bring to your attention, there have been some significant developments within these evidence types over recent years. I don't think it will come as a surprise to anybody that forensic evidence, forensic science moves on apace. So if we start then with fingerprints, fingerprints are a staple of any crime scene examination. If we find potential points of entry or items that may be considered alien to a scene, then we're obviously going to consider those for the potential to bear fingerprints or ridge detail. As fingerprints, ridge detail are largely made up of water. It's almost counterintuitive to expect that they're going to survive in a fire, but unless they've been subjected to direct burning, they very often do. They can be protected by soot on surfaces, and that's very often found at points of entry, doors and windows. They can be absorbed into paper and textiles because, as I say, they are largely fluid. Or they may even be on protected surfaces within the scene of a fire itself. And the example that Nick gave earlier on, I'm aware that that contained a bucket. That bucket could have been recovered later on. And the underside of the bucket, having been protected from the fire, would actually have provided quite a good surface for fingerprint examination. Importantly, with fingerprints, they can be used not only to identify a culprit or someone who's come into contact with that, but more importantly, perhaps, their position and orientation can be interpreted by fingerprint experts to give an account of a culprit's actions within the scene prior to the fire. Again, this can be used to increase our level of certainty that the crime has been committed and or that the fire has been deliberately set. If we move on to DNA, DNA is another source of evidence that can be used to identify a suspect or deceased from time to time. And again, where we find items of potential evidence, evidential importance, we're going to consider those for the presence of DNA. Now, in common with fingerprints, DNA can be a fragile form of evidence. It is just a protein, and they often denature at high temperatures. But again, DNA can and does survive intense heat and subsequent firefighting actions. It does this often not just in a manner which allows for sampling and identification of a suspect, but in many cases, it's actually going to survive in a state which allows for the orientation and spread of that evidence to be interpreted. And when I say that's probably going to come as no surprise to anyone, that in particular, I'm talking about blood evidence and blood pattern analysis. So in particular, as scene examiners, I'm going to be looking for blood patterns within a scene. These can then be interpreted to give a good account by forensic biologists of what has gone on, what has happened within a scene prior to that fire. It doesn't have to be blood, it can be other bodily fluids. They all survive in fires reasonably well, again, counterintuitively. In the case you can see above, blood patterns actually remained within the scene, but even at the doorway that you can see there, the room off to the right had gone to a post-flashover phase. But even at that point, the blood survived and left an identifiable footwear mark in blood on the carpet just outside the doorway there. And that footwear mark was later developed in luminol and was able to be identified to a particular item of footwear. One note of caution that I'd give at this point is that the Scottish Police Authority has moved to a DNA system called DNA24 Global Filer. Now this gives world-leading sensitivity in terms of being able to identify DNA, but it does bring issues of contamination and cross-contamination that, as Nick rightly said earlier on, we've been getting across to the Fire and Rescue Service, we've been getting across to our attending police officers, but it's something that I think everybody needs to be made more aware of and to try to bear in mind at every scene they attend. So what we've looked at when we're looking at fingerprints and DNA are evidence types that form one side, if you like, of Locard's principle, where you are leaving your traces within a scene. But of course, the other side of that is that the scene can leave its traces on a suspect. And one of the most important sources of information in a fire is glass. Glass is something that can very easily give a very early indicator regarding whether a fire has been deliberately set or not. And it's these ready reckoners, if you like, these early indicators that we find very useful because they can allow us to target areas that need particular preservation and target areas that need to be examined later on. Fracture patterns in glass can be used to determine whether a pane has failed due to an impact, and it can actually be used to determine what side the impact has come from. Fracture patterns can also determine whether the fire, the effects of that fire have caused the glass to fracture, or even that fracture has happened as the result of an explosive overpressure. And again, depending on what we see initially in the fractures of the glass, this can steer the investigator towards a particular determination of cause, or identifying areas being one of particular interest. In addition, control glass samples can also be taken and can be compared against glass samples found on, for example, a suspect's clothing. So they can actually be used to identify a suspect or a culprit as well. If we move to hairs and fibers, as the slide maybe suggests, and as you can probably guess yourselves, hairs and fibers can be a real challenge in a fire scene. Unsurprisingly, they don't survive well given the action of a fire. And even where they do, the action of that fire, the heat within, perhaps, can affect them to the point where comparison can be difficult. But they are something that we can still look to recover from a scene, and it is something that we still bear in mind. If we move on again, we come to physical fit and tool marks. Now, obviously, Nick has spoken about this as well. Obviously, where the fire investigator sees evidence of tool marks to a door or a window, assuming these haven't been put there legitimately by Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, forcing entry to tackle the fire, this can give another very early indication of a potential crime scene. And again, it's going to allow us to target areas for preservation or for further examination. Where a suspect's identified and where items are potentially recovered from their person or from their property, and then further items are recovered from within a scene, then these can be compared with good results. And you can see some of those comparisons above there, where perhaps a wick has been taken from a rag or a towel within a house. And on the right, you can see where glass has been found on a suspect's clothing and found to match pretty closely there glass that was found at the scene. If we move on to accelerants, accelerants are probably something that you would associate closely with fires. The potential use of a liquid fuel as an accelerant to increase the intensity or speed of development of a fire is a clear indicator, or should be, that a deliberate ignition may have taken place. Similarly to DNA, these can be detected and identified in minute quantities. So there are real issues of cross-contamination again, and some of those are listed above. One recent development in this area centres on work carried out by Swedish fire investigators, where they found that certain wavelengths of UV light may actually enable a fluorescence examination of burnt accelerant traces. Now, there's informal validation processes going on with SPA and Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and that is going to allow for targeted sampling, which is going to allow, hopefully, for better results and increased certainty as to the cause of a fire. Finally, I suppose we have electronic evidence, which is probably something that you wouldn't traditionally associate with forensics. But certainly all police and scene examiners are aware of the potential for a mobile device to try to pair with a Wi-Fi router within a locus or a house. And this is particularly where a culprit may previously have been logged on or connected to that Wi-Fi router. Times and dates, depending on the make and model of pairings, can be stored and can be retrieved to provide positional data for a suspect's phone. Again, that's given us the potential to increase our level of certainty with regards to the cause of a fire if we're able to place a suspect at the locus at the time of the fire. And it may also be possible to carry out the same kind of examination with telephone connections to in-car devices. However, this form of evidence is also fragile, as it's possible to overwrite that, and as a matter of course, we would be going into scenes with our telephones in a safe mode if we take a telephone in at all. So how does this work in practice? What does it look like? Well, we come back to the example that my colleague gave earlier on. In this case, the arrowed items, the indicated items, were a basin at the front door of that locus where a fire had led to the death of the people inside. In that basin, there was fabric soaked in petrol. Obviously, that's a clear indicator that a fire may well have been deliberately set. DNA was obtained from that fragment of fabric, and the DNA was linked to further DNA samples that were taken from the interior of a partially burned out car the next day. That resulting connections actually allowed police to concentrate attention on a male who was subsequently found guilty of a murder in that case. So thank you very much. What I'd like you to take away is that all the traditional forms of forensic evidence can be found at the scene. And I'd just reiterate my colleagues' concerns that I think it's clear that police and fire brigade can sometimes be quite guarded in how we deal with insurance sectors. However, hopefully, if we're having discourses like this, then that is an issue that can be addressed. Thank you very much. I'll hand you on now to Gareth Williams.
Thank you very much, Graham. I'll just wait to take control. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to some current clients and also those I haven't worked with before. Like Mike, I've been fortunate to work in both the public sector and private sector. I was a CSI with the Australian Federal Police for 12 years, specialising in fire and explosion investigations, with the vast majority of those being arson cases. After spending 3 years in the UAE training Abu Dhabi Police, I joined IFIC Forensics 7 years ago. So the cases I investigate now are a good mixture of domestic, commercial, accidental, and of course deliberate, which is the focus of today's talk. Now, there will be some crossover with the topics that the previous speakers have discussed, but I will be looking at the investigation of deliberate fires from the private sector perspective, how we can complement any public sector investigation, and how we can increase the level of certainty, which is really the reason our clients are instructing us a lot of the time. So when are we involved in the investigation of a deliberate fire from the private sector side of things? It may be in the early stages when there is already an extensive public sector investigation underway. It may be in the early stages when there is a limited public sector investigation. Sometimes we'll be involved after the public sector investigation is complete. And then there's also those occasions when there has been no public sector investigation and we're on site. So we encounter all of these, often dependent on the nature of the fire and its location. For example, in more remote areas, there may not have been a police forensic investigation, or it may be limited in scope. There's also those times where we are investigating a fire where there's been no public sector involvement other than the initial fire brigade response. The fire may be deemed to be accidental by the fire service, and during the course of our investigation, we may conclude it has been deliberately lit. So the question for us then is how we go about feeding that information back to the local police, which I'll discuss in a later slide. So the methods we can utilise in trying to add value to the deliberate fire investigation is obviously, as Nick mentioned, the scientific method underpins all of what we do in terms of fire investigation. We have to consider all potential causes of the fire, collect evidence in an appropriate manner, provide clear and unambiguous findings to our client, liaise with the police and fire service when possible, and on those rare occasions, provide unbiased expert court testimony when we're called to court. So even if we are told from the outset by others that the fire is clearly a deliberate act, it's crucial that we don't get tunnel vision and that we consider other potential causes of the fire. So in a report, this may be a lengthy and detailed section, or it may just be a simple paragraph. But in either case, it's imperative that we can demonstrate that we have followed the scientific method regarding the gathering of evidence and the formation of our conclusions. Now, this is only a brief presentation, so I won't be touching on the interpretation of fire patterns and fire spread. It's outside the scope of this, and it's clearly a large topic to discuss. Communication with the public sector is crucial. the private sector fire investigator needs to establish contact with any relevant public sector investigators ASAP. We have to be mindful and respectful of the fact certain information will not be able to be released by the police or fire service. Again, Nick has mentioned the reasons why. There's just times where they just cannot release information to us from a legal background. Information that may be able to be shared includes confirmation of whether the fire is being treated as a deliberate act or not, whether there are any suspects or whether anyone has been charged, a list of evidence removed from the scene, and if it's got to that stage, potentially laboratory results, and whether there's any CCTV footage or alarm log data. And again, crucially to us, what we really need to know is a description of any alterations made to the scene prior to our investigation. So this communication can be vital in many cases. Poor communication can lead to delays in the investigation and potentially delays in our reporting to our client. It can lead to missing evidence or information and potentially even erroneous conclusions being reached. There are times when I receive cooperation from fire service investigators or police, CID, etc., that makes my job much easier. Then there's also those times where I come up against a brick wall and it is just impossible to speak to the relevant public sector investigator or to get replies to emails. That's part of the job. And as I mentioned, we are mindful of the fact that information just cannot be released to us at certain times. So the majority of fire scenes will be disturbed from the necessary actions of first responders extinguishing the fire and any subsequent overhaul that's been carried out. So we, as private sector fire investigators, need to try and distinguish between any damage caused by the fire service forcing entry and any damage from forced entry by those who deliberately lit the fire. And again, communication is crucial. The major scene disturbance that we'll encounter will usually be from excavations carried out by the fire service fire investigator or the police forensic team. So we appreciate that the public sector investigators need to do their job, and that will often involve considerable scene disturbance. So the challenge for us is trying to determine exactly what has been moved and from where, and how that can hamper the interpretation of fire patterns. So I've titled this one A Pristine Scene, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but from my perspective, this was a good scene to work on. Despite there being extensive structural collapse, there had been minimal scene disturbance by the public sector. CCTV footage existed for this scene, which I'll get to later. I'll show you a few clips. This footage confirmed the fire and explosion as having been deliberately caused. Now, although the police were investigating it, the scene was undisturbed, as I mentioned, with no excavation of the partial building collapse having taken place. So this meant I was able to carry out the investigation from a good starting point of no evidence spoliation, and I could feed back my findings to not only the client, but also to the investigating police. This scene was one I investigated in a fairly remote location. I had very limited information prior to being on site and very little witness information even while I was on site. So that doesn't mean that nothing can be done, of course. The normal procedures of identifying fire patterns and fire spread indicators can still be employed. However, when the damage is this uniform, in some situations, it may be preferable to delay the investigation to allow time for information gathering that might at least narrow down the area of interest. So if, for example, there was CCTV evidence available or witness evidence available that indicated the fire starting in a particular vehicle or area. So again, communication with others, including our client, can dictate how the investigation proceeds, and it can prevent a needle in a haystack approach. This can lead to a more targeted approach with more chance of being able to provide useful findings to the client. Sometimes without knowing whether an incident is being treated as suspicious by police, there will be indicators of a police forensic investigation having taken place previously, such as fingerprint powder. In this instance, as you can see on the image on the right, there was fingerprint powder on one of the caravan doors. At my time on site, the witness information and information from police was limited. So it was good to at least see that there had been a police investigation and in what areas they had inspected. Now this is the type of example that we encounter fairly often in the private sector. The room of fire origin has been extensively searched by the fire service and police investigators, and the vast majority of debris from this room has been excavated and cleared into another room in the property. So in this situation, we still need to carry on with the investigation as thoroughly as normal, document the scene as thoroughly as usual, and not deviate from the scientific method. So these images relate to that same case from the previous slide. So all of the fire debris from the room of origin and the hallway had been moved to this room, piled to head height in areas. Obviously, a very thorough scene inspection had been carried out by the public sector investigators. Items of interest had been laid out on a table by them, with some left behind, with other evidence no doubt removed by them from the scene. So in situations like this, a realistic approach has to be taken. And again, coming back to the communication with the client being necessary to determine the extent of the inspection of already searched debris. In our line of work, there will be cost implications to the client, and they will often have to balance those potential further costs with the realistic potential or not for useful findings. So the communication is critical. We must clearly explain to the client the prospect for being able to add to the certainty of the findings. Within IFIC Forensics, we use an arson screening program on all cases. So the mere use of a checklist can sometimes raise suspicions that weren't obvious at the time of the initial claim. Some of the indicators we look for are shown here. Of course, individually, many of these are not conclusive, but when multiple red flags are raised, the level of certainty is generally increased. And this links in with fraud detection systems that insurers may have in place. Now, the videos, I need to pass you back to Mike briefly to see if we can show these videos in another platform. This may take 30 seconds or so. I'm not sure. While we're doing that, Claire, do you want to see if there's any questions, or should we save that to the end?
We can save it till the end, I think. And if we aren't able to get to your questions, we can circulate them around after the webinar.
Okay. That actually looks like it's come up fairly quickly, so we'll start playing this one. So CCTV evidence can sometimes make a case. It can be of huge benefit, but it does not mean the other evidence gathering means can be ignored or reduced. The individual in this footage clearly had an issue with owners of the nightclub. He was attempting to firebomb. It was raining heavily. There are witnesses to his actions. I think you'll probably find the footage in this clip fairly conclusive as it plays for the next 20 seconds or so. You can see him squirting some kind of liquid from a bottle on his motorbike, lights it. Unfortunately, sets himself on fire and then makes a less than quick getaway. If only all cases were this simple. All right, might do the next one, please, Mike. So this is footage from that the previous photograph I showed earlier where the scene hadn't been disturbed too heavily. I received this footage before I was on site. You can see the explosion happening and then two individuals running away immediately after the explosion. Now they're not running from inside the building, it's a side alley next to the building. So obviously their behavior in this footage is very suspicious, but not conclusive at this stage in terms of their involvement. Okay, next, please, Mike. So we're looking at the left-hand side as the area to focus on this clip. This is those same two individuals. You see they're lighting toilet paper, standing by the door, throws it in, and almost immediately quite a large explosion. Then they race down this alley onto the road. So clearly there was an explosive atmosphere inside the building, most likely from these individuals dispersing what we believe is methyl methacrylate inside. This was stored in containers inside the building as part of a dental laboratory. So it's possible that they were only intending to start a fire and the explosion has caught them by surprise. And obviously they're both lucky to escape unharmed. So in cases such as this, once evidence like this is available, determining the point of origin. Sorry, Mike, we can just pause this one. So just back with the other one, determining the point of origin or the ignition source becomes less of a focus, and the on-site inspection can focus on attempting to find evidence of who the offenders are or whether they have any links to the business in question, which is of clear interest to insurers for potential repudiation purposes. Next, please. Sometimes the CCTV footage will be inconclusive or possibly a red herring. This individual in this footage is outside a large warehouse approximately 15 minutes before the first signs of the fire. Obviously, his behaviour is unusual, pacing backwards and forwards. The warehouse is just out of shot to the right, does an about turn there, and then walks back out of shot and is not seen again in any of the other footage. So this is after hours when the factory was closed and there were no other businesses open or any apparent legitimate reason for someone to be there. So this information needs to be considered, but it has little effect on the overall scene investigation in terms of methodology and procedures. Next, please. So this is footage from inside this same warehouse. And again, it's top left that you're looking for here. Very poor quality footage. We've got cobwebs covering the camera. And we can see that glowing in the back left corner of this factory. So this was the best angle for the capture of the start of the fire. And this is quite typical of the standard of footage that we often encounter with low resolution footage or cameras not quite pointing in the right way or not capturing exactly what we want. So this clip allowed the area of origin to be narrowed down by reducing the area of interest in the factory to about 1 quadrant. The factory had dimensions of about 70 by 40 meters, and there were very few remaining fire patterns to allow an area of origin to be determined any other way. So the footage was helpful, but it did not assist in any way with the potential determining the cause of the fire. Again, the CCTV is one source of information for the investigator to gather, but all other sources must be established too. So it can have limitations, but in some cases, it can be crucial. Okay, Mike, if you can hand it back to me, please. So onto alarm systems. Alarm information can provide very valuable evidence. For example, an alarm log may show the security system was set religiously every night, except for the night of the fire, even when the occupants were away. We have to be very cautious when attempting to retrieve data from these systems, as the information can be lost forever if proper procedures are not in place. So we should always utilize a trained professional to try and interrogate this data. The degree of usefulness of the information we get depends on damage, the extent of damage to the system. It may provide a log of the last authorized entry and exit and any unauthorized entry, and it may indicate fraudulent behavior, again, adding to the level of certainty. Very good indicator of a deliberately lit fire is the presence of multiple points of origin. However, it is not good enough to say it's multi-seated, therefore it's deliberate. So the investigator needs to examine each potential seat and explain why it has not spread from one of the others. This one, a remote bungalow, had 10 completely separate seats of fire. There was oil, petrol containers, a burning tyre in the kitchen, and firelighters scattered around the kitchen worktops. The occupier suggested that a window may have been forced as the doors were locked. It transpired, however, that some of the items, such as the tyre and a 25-litre container, couldn't fit through the small opening windows. The doors were locked when the fire service arrived, and the only person with a key was the occupier. Attempts to start a fire that do not work for various reasons are another excellent indicator of arson. Bedding may be attempted to be lit, but may only result in localized fire damage, as you'll see on the image on the left. These two photographs are from separate cases where the rest of the property had sustained significant fire damage, and fire damage to these two areas could not be explained by any reason other than a separate attempt to start another fire. Just conscious of the time, Graham has already discussed in detail types of forensic evidence, so I won't go through that in any depth. So what should the private sector investigator do if they find evidence of criminal activity? There will be occasions where we identify evidence that the fire has been deliberately lit that for whatever reason may not be known to the public sector investigator. So this could include finding physical evidence such as ignition sources, evidence of multiple seats of the fire, ignitable liquid residue, etc. It could include witness evidence that may be that we have gathered from policyholders or others that had not been provided to the police or fire service. Or as Nick mentioned, it may be evidence from them that contradicts the information that the public sector investigators were told. The evidence could also include alarm data and CCTV footage, as I've mentioned. And sometimes it's the case that we, through excavating the scene, may uncover the CCTV hard drive that was not known to the public sector investigators. So the onus then is on the private sector investigator to contact the client and determine how to best relay this new information to the relevant authority. This case here involved an explosion and subsequent fire and was treated as a deliberate act by the public sector from the very early stages. Following my scene inspection, I called the fire service fire investigator from this area, as I know him quite well and have a good working relationship with him. During the conversation, I'd mentioned the presence of the firelighters and the cigarette lighter shown in the kitchen, one of the less damaged rooms in the property. He had no idea what I was talking about, so I sent him the images and he contacted the police forensic investigators. They confirmed that those items had not been present during their investigation the week prior to mine. Someone had gained entry to the scene and for whatever reason placed them there. So this is an example again of the two-way communication I mentioned earlier and how the public sector and private sector can assist each other in these cases. In terms of the private sector investigation of fires, loss adjusters or insurers will often want us to comment on possible fraudulent activity by the policyholder. So regarding fraudulent activity, we can categorise the individual as either having forensic awareness or not having forensic awareness. So forensic awareness may include attempting to make the fire look like an electrical fire. There may be a delayed action in starting the fire. The insured may have a solid alibi at the time the fire was discovered, and they may find one method that works and use it multiple times. Now, those with a lack of forensic awareness it may result in there being obvious multiple points of origin. They may overuse flammable liquid, and they may remove high-value goods prior to the fire being lit. Clearly, the bottom points will make our job easier, but it is by the careful and systematic scene inspection and evidence gathering that the points at the top here can be uncovered and fraudulent activity proved. Okay, just 2 slides to go. So again, increasing the level of certainty, there's also opportunities for loss adjusters to maximise the benefits from the investigation. So the majority of our clients, in terms of those who initially instruct us, are loss adjusters. So things that loss adjusters can do on site include, where possible, appointing forensics without delay, recording the scene themselves, even if that's only with a small notebook and a mobile phone or point and shoot camera, discouraging or at least carefully monitoring the removal of anything from the scene, where possible, not allowing tampering with alarm systems or CCTV, ensuring disturbance to the scene is minimised as much as possible, and on those very rare occasions where items of evidence have to be removed or protected, just being aware of how to record and package those items appropriately. Now, this is, of course, all dependent on the extent of the initial police or fire service investigation. So finally, as a summary, increasing the level of certainty in the investigation of deliberate fires. How can a private sector fire investigator provide value? Well, we provide expert opinion, gather information from public sector sources, assist the public sector investigators by informing them of any new evidence, and crucially try and identify repudiation prospects or recovery prospects for the client. So even if a thorough police and fire service investigation has been carried out, we can add value to the level of certainty. There are occasions where, for whatever reason, we may go to greater lengths to retrieve evidence or excavate the scene. And we may also have a different perspective, such as a review of the insurance policy conditions, which may dictate some of the interview questions and physical evidence examinations. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was of interest, and I'll hand you back to Mike for some closing comments.
Thank you, Gareth. Very much appreciated. Apologise for running over that slight bit. We should only be another minute or two, and then we can take questions if you would like, but we will reach out for those that we can't get to. So again, thank you, Nick, Graham, and Gareth for sharing your perspectives. We are definitely in the business of gathering and interpreting information. Collaboration is crucial. And how can we improve on sharing information? Well, I think this is worth a continued conversation between the different organizations. I think it can be seen clearly that the message to increasing the level of certainty for deliberate fire investigations is a quick response to attend the scene, scene preservation, methodically recording and examining a scene, collaboration between the agencies, and effective information gathering, and also a clear, concise, and credible expert opinion. There's a long-standing but still accurate study by Hirschberger and Miller, and this is from 1978, and identified that greater attention must be paid to the financial position of the insured during the underwriting process, and that scientific investigative techniques should be used for fraud detection. It is anticipated that the similar trends of deliberate fires will continue as society adjusts to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. For those who may be interested, please contact us for our latest arson fact sheet, and we will be certain to get one to you. We're now at the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for letting us share our perspective about increasing the level of certainty for a deliberate fire investigation. And I'm going to pass you over to my colleague, who will now provide instructions to invite questions. We'll take 2 or 3, and then what we will do is any that you would like to send to us at the address you see on your screen, or via our website, you can get in touch, and your messages or questions on the chat board will take note, and also we will reply. So thank you for your time, and I apologize for running over those few minutes.
Thank you, Mike. We did have a couple of really interesting questions that came in. So I'll start off. Is there a balance to be struck between the effectiveness of methods for fire extinguishing and their potential damaging effect on the remaining scene? And I'll just open it to the panelists.
So Nick, yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, there definitely is. Crews are now taught, again, we've moved on a lot. Crews are now taught the use of sprays instead of jets. They're now taught how to gas cool instead of applying water directly to a burning area. This again, it's more effective for extinguishing the fire, but it's also more effective for preserving the scene. And crews are aware of that. I mean, we really have had a mind shift in the last 20 years about how we extinguish fires. We will attend scenes now that are almost intact instead of stuff getting knocked over and barged over. And if crews do move stuff, they will tell you where they've moved it, and they'll give you the reasons for doing it. So yeah, we have definitely moved on, definitely, and it can only be positive for the investigators in both sectors to attend scenes like that.
Okay, great, thank you. Another one, how can we increase exchange of information between private and public sector?
Oh, very, very good question. I think that we have to build relationships as one of them, but between us, we need to get more familiar with what each other is looking for. In my day in the public sector, there was many a times where a private sector would get in touch and they would come out to the office and we would sit down and review the information together. I know that in some jurisdictions, that's tightened up for data protection and so forth. But I think when we then do send a request, sometimes the process is, if we know the fire investigation, say in this example, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service attended, we make that request to their organisation that we would like to recognise the fire investigation officer or possibly the officer in charge who first attended the incident, and we can start to ask the questions. And then eventually, you can request the likes of the electronic report from the level 1 that Nick shared with you about. And we can also request copies of reports that are the full reports for the fire investigation, but it can take time. We can also request copies of photographs. But I think the first step is for the fire investigator in the private sector to contact the fire investigation, just say, listen, can you confirm that you collected anything from the scene? Can you confirm, the types of things that Gareth covered? Are you treating it as deliberate? Is it still under investigation? This bit of information can be very helpful. So it's communication will increase it. But I do think that we could share more. I do think so, and I think we need to grow towards that, and I think the agencies need to spend more time speaking to each other about that. That's my view, but I'd like to offer maybe from the fire service or the Scottish Police Authority what their view would be.
It's Nick here from the fire service. I completely agree with you. I think for us, we're at the mercy of a strategic goal. The strategic leadership team dictate our working practices, and I think we have to, move that from the bottom up by proving the value of collaborative working. We've proved it with our partnerships with the agencies, the police, and with the scene examiners, and we need to say that there is value in us working together. But there is a reluctance, and it's not going to be an easy thing. It's a big hurdle there. Strategically, they're not showing any movement towards that at all. And I did speak with legal prior to this, and legal have told me that we just don't share. Bottom line, we don't share unless you go through the existing protocols that we have. And a lot of times there will be a cost to it. However, they were keen to say that being the largest fire service, a lot of stuff we give out is free, but other services will charge for. So, but you know what I mean? They are looking, I think, at protecting, one, the integrity of the investigation, and two, I think it's just they don't see the value, and we need to change that.
Yeah, I think it's Graham here. Just to reiterate that about the value, I think speaking from a police side of things, I think it's fair to say that the police senior investigating officers as a cadre tend to be fairly guarded in their approach to how they would deal with, for want of a better word, the insurance sector. I think obviously relationships are the most important part of that, and we don't get those without speaking between one another. But allowing the senior investigating officer from the police side of things to be able to see that there is value to be gained, there are additional expertise, additional investigation tools, and additional examinations that can be carried out. I think that's important, and that is a way forward.
Great, thank you. In the interest of time, I will stop there. We do have more questions, but what we'll do is we will put these to the panelists and they will be able to create a response, and we'll follow up with you. The webinar is recorded, so we will happily send you the recording, and feel free to share it with your colleagues who weren't able to make it today. We'll also provide some additional materials on arson investigations. So on behalf of all of our experts, Thank you very, very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.